You are standing in a stone cell in Rouen, winter 1431. The walls are damp, there is no window, the door is iron. Outside, in the corridors of this military fortress, men in English livery move with the certainty of those who have already written the ending. Inside, a 19-year-old woman sits in chains, not the light restraints given to ecclesiastical prisoners, but the irons used for common criminals and traitors. This is not a monastery, this is not a place of spiritual correction. This is a courtroom built inside a dungeon, and the trial has already reached its verdict before the first question is asked. Her name was Jean. History would call her Joan of Arc. But in the winter and spring of 1431, she was called heretic, relapsed sinner, and sorceress by men who had constructed a legal architecture designed not to judge her but to erase her. The capture had occurred months earlier, in May 1430, outside Compiègne. She was pulled from her horse by Burgundian soldiers, allies of England, and sold, not rescued, not ransomed by the king she had crowned, sold. For 10,000 livres, she passed from the Burgundians to the English command, a transaction recorded in ledgers with the same bureaucratic efficiency as the purchase of horses or grain. She was an asset, a problem to be solved through procedure. By January, she was in Rouen, imprisoned in a tower of the castle under the authority of the Earl of Warwick. The English needed her death, but they needed it to be legal. They needed it to be holy. If she died as a soldier, she would be a martyr. If she died as a witch condemned by the church, she would be proof that Charles VI had been crowned by a heretic, and his kingship would collapse into illegitimacy. The trial, therefore, was not about discovering truth. It was about manufacturing it. Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a French cleric loyal to England, assembled the tribunal. He summoned theologians from the University of Paris, canon lawyers, Dominican inquisitors, men whose expertise was not warfare, but language. They would question her in Latin, a language she did not speak fluently. They would ask her to explain mystical experiences using theological terms she had never been taught. They would demand she reconcile her visions with doctrines she could not name. And when she answered plainly in the rural dialect of Domremy, they would call her evasive. This was not chaos. This was system. The trial record survives. It is one of the most complete judicial documents of the medieval period, spanning months of interrogation, thousands of words, meticulous notations of her answers. Scholars have studied it for centuries. What they find is not a transcript of justice, but a transcript of entrapment. The questions were designed to corner. Every answer she gave was bent into a framework of guilt. Do you believe you were in a state of grace? If she said yes, she would be guilty of presumption, claiming certainty of salvation, a heresy. If she said no, she would admit to mortal sin, disqualifying her visions as demonic. She answered, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." They wrote it down. They moved to the next question. She was held in chains day and night, not because she was violent, not because she had attempted escape, because the English commander, the Earl of Warwick, ordered it. Because keeping her in a military prison under the guard of soldiers rather than nuns was a violation of ecclesiastical law that no one with authority chose to prevent, because her body, like her words, had to be controlled. The guards were English soldiers, 5 of them, rotating in shifts. They watched her dress, they watched her sleep, they were there when she woke. The trial record does not discuss what happened in that cell when the clerics were not present, but Joan herself would later say she feared for her safety. She wore men's clothing, a tunic, hose, boots laced to the thigh, not as a theological statement, but because it was the only protection she had, clothing that could not be easily removed, clothing that marked her as something other than available. The tribunal condemned her for it anyway. Wearing men's clothing, they said, was a rejection of God's natural order, a perversion, a sign of her damnation. They listed it formally among her crimes: cross-dressing, a violation of Deuteronomy 22:5, a heresy in cloth. By late May, the trial reached its breaking point. Joan was brought into the cemetery of Saint-Ouen, where a platform had been built and a crowd assembled. A priest delivered a sermon on her sins. A pyre stood ready in the square. She was 19 years old, exhausted, isolated, and she was told that if she recanted, she would be spared the fire and transferred to a church prison. She would be held among women. The chains would be removed. She signed an abjuration, a short document, prepared in advance. She could not read it. She made her mark. This should have been the end. According to church law, a relapsed heretic, someone who confessed and then returned to their sin, could be executed. But a penitent heretic was to be imprisoned for life. She had confessed. She had submitted. The English authorities were furious. 4 days later, Joan was wearing men's clothing again. What happened in those 4 days is contested, debated, analyzed. The trial record states that she resumed wearing men's clothing of her own free will. 2 decades later, after her rehabilitation trial, witnesses would testify otherwise. They would say her women's clothing was taken from her cell during the night. They would say a guard or several guards assaulted her, or tried to. They would say she put the men's clothing back on because it was the only garment left to her, and because she was afraid. The judges returned. They asked her why she wore men's clothing again. She said her voices had told her it was wrong to abjure. She said she had been deceived. She said, and this is in the record, "It is better to do penance once than to be in danger forever." They declared her elapsed. The law was satisfied. On the morning of May 30, 1431, Joan of Arc was led from her cell to the old market square in Rouen. She asked for a cross. An English soldier broke a stick and tied it into the shape of one. A priest brought a processional crucifix from a nearby church and held it before her as she was chained to the stake. The pyre was built high, higher than usual, so the executioner could not reach her to strangle her before the flames rose, a small mercy sometimes afforded to the condemned. This was not mercy. This was spectacle. She burned alive, fully conscious. Witnesses said she called out the name of Jesus until the smoke took her voice. Afterwards, the executioner was ordered to rake back the coals so the crowd could see her body, to prove she had not escaped, to prove no magic had saved her. Then the fire was rebuilt, and her remains burned twice more, until there was nothing left but ash and fragments of bone, which were thrown into the Seine, so no relics could be venerated. This was not rage, this was policy. 25 years later, the church reopened her case. Pope Calixtus III authorized a rehabilitation trial. New witnesses testified. The original judges were condemned. Joan was declared innocent, a martyr, wrongly executed. In 1920, she was canonized, made a saint. France claims her as a national symbol. Statues stand in her name. Schoolchildren learn her story as one of heroism and faith. But the trial record remains. The chains remain in the archive of procedure. The men who questioned her were not demons. They were theologians, trained in law, operating within a framework that was recognized, cited, approved. They followed the rules. The rules allowed this. We build trials now with different language. We speak of due process, evidence standards, rights of the accused. We do not chain 19-year-olds in military prisons and call it theology. We do not burn them in market squares. We have moved the violence behind walls, beneath language, into structures we call justice, because we have named them so. But when power needs a body to break in order to hold itself together, when the law is not a shelter but a trap, built carefully by men who already know what it must prove, how different is the system from the stake. You are standing in a stone cell. The door is iron. Outside, someone is writing the ending. Who decides whether you burned or whether you were executed lawfully?